Welcome to Algebra Snap. In this video we'll be talking about radicals.
What are radicals? A radical is an expression that uses a root such as a square root or a cube root.
So we're going to solve some radicals. So first we're going to be simplifying the square root of 180. So first you want to break it up into perfect squares since it is a square root equation. So to do that you'd first break it into 9 and 20. So you would then have 3 times the square root of 20 since the square root of 9 can be simplified to 3. So then the square root of 20 can be further broken down into the square root of 4 times the square root of 5. The square root of 4 can be simplified as 2. So you get 3 times 2 times the square root of 5. And so that equals 6 times the square root of 5. And at the bottom we have another one. So you have 2 times the square root of 50. So then the square root of 50 can be broken down as the square root of 25 times the square root of 2. And so that can be simplified as 2 times 5 times the square root of 2. And for the other one, you have 2 times the cube root of 125. And so the cube root of 125 is 5, so it would be 2 times 5.
Now we're talking about adding and subtracting radicals. When adding or subtracting radicals, you have to make sure that you are combining like terms. So if the number inside of the radical is the same, you just have to combine the coefficients. In this example, it's 6 rad 15 plus 2 rad 15. And since the radicals are the same, you just add the coefficients. So 6 plus 2 is 8. And the radicals stay the same, 8 radical 15. Same thing for subtraction. If the radical is the same, then you just subtract the coefficients. So 7 radical 3 minus 2 radical 3. You just subtract the coefficients. So 7 minus 2 is 5. You get 5 radical 3. But when you see a problem that does not have like terms, then you have to do something more complicated. First, you have to factor out the perfect square. So for radical 18, that means finding the perfect square. So that's radical 9 times radical 2, radical 9 being the perfect square. Then for 128, you have to do the same thing. So radical 64 times radical 2, radical 64 being the perfect square. Then you have to take the square root of the perfect square you just found. For example, radical 9 would simplify into 3, and radical 64 would simplify into 8. Then the unsimplified radicals just move down. Then you have to multiply the coefficients, so 10 times 3 would be 30 radical 2, the radical stays the same, plus 10 times 8 would be 80, radical stays the same. Now, notice that you have like terms. So now all you have to do is add the coefficient. Then you have to add the coefficients. 30 plus 80, radical 2, which would be 110 radical 2. Same thing subtracting. Find the perfect square. Simplify that perfect square. Now you have like terms. Subtract the coefficients, and then you have your answer.
So now we're going to practice multiplying radicals. So we're going to multiply the square root of 3 times the square root of 6, which equals the square root of 18. And since we want to break it down into perfect squares, we're going to break it down into the square root of 9 and the square root of 2. And so if you simplify the square root of 2, you get 3, and you can't simplify the square root of 2. So your final answer is 3 times the square root of 2. The next one we're going to try and simplify or multiply is going to be the square root of 4 times the square root of 16, which gets you the square root of 64, which equals 8. Another way you could do it is the square root of 4 equals 2, and the square root of 16 equals 4, so 2 times 4 equals 8. And the final one we're going to practice is cube roots. So the cube root of 125 is 5, and the cube root of 27 is 3, and so the final answer is 15.
Lastly, we're going to talk about dividing radicals. First, you have to separate the radicals and the coefficients. So in the problem 4 radical 14 over 8 radical 2, that can be separated into 4 over 8 times radical 14 over radical 2. Then you simplify the coefficient fraction and combine the radicals. That would give you 1/2 over 2, the 1/2 times radical 14 over 2. Then you simplify the radical fraction, which would give you 1/2 times 1/2 radical 7. And then if you put the radical over an imaginary 1, so it would be radical 7 over 1, then you multiply the numerator, which would be radical 7, and the denominator would be just be 2. So you end up with radical 7 over 2. That's it for Algebra Snap, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.